Welcome to American Memoirs, a podcast dedicated to American history, focused on the stories from those who made it. Today, we're thrilled to welcome a guest whose work has reshaped our understanding of pre-Columbian Americas and the profound impact of globalization following Columbus's voyages. Charles C. Mann, a journalist and author of pivotal works such as 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, and 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created, who is joining us to explore the story of the founding of the Haudenosaunee, commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, their way of governance and life, and how it impacted the founding fathers of the United States. Charles's writing, characterized by its meticulous research and compelling narrative, challenges conventional wisdom and brings to light the complex civilizations and ecological landscapes that had existed in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. His work on the Columbian Exchange, the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, and ideas between the Americas and the Old World has sparked conversations on the global impact of these exchanges and their role in shaping the world as we know it today. It's a personal honor to have him on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure to talk with you.
Cool. So the Iroquois Confederacy, what is the origin story of them?
Well, first I should explain what it is, and I should also explain that it's and this is most important, it's here today. It's been in continuous existence for a very long time, and it's a very vital group that is here today, and has plenty of people who can speak for them. It's originally a confederation of 5 different indigenous nations. The Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And those are the English names for them. Each of them have their own names, and each of them speak slightly different Iroquoian languages, so that each of them, of course, have names for the others, and so that if you really want to get into it, there's a whole complex naming system. Later on, during the colonial period, a 6th group, the Tuscarora, joined them. And what's remarkable about them is, from the outside point of view, like myself, I should explain that I'm not a member of them, and I cannot speak for them. I can just tell you, what I've seen, or learned from talking with them and reading. The remarkable thing, one of the many remarkable things about them, is that they formed a government, and there's some argument about when this was, but hundreds of years ago, that in certain ways was struck the Europeans of the time as a model, either good or bad, of governance that was strikingly different from the way that Europeans of the time had governments with kings and so forth. And they were, for many European thinkers of the time, kind of like the shining example of another way of doing things. Now, and they, of course, had their own ideas about the Europeans and so forth, and have been involved in a continuous struggle with first the British, and then the French, and then the U.S. that goes on to this very day, in which they have insisted on their own self-determination. They're really, as I say, a remarkable bunch of people, and they are divided between parts of upstate New York and Canada, just across the St. Lawrence River, and that's who they are. Although it's a tiny and inadequate summary of hundreds and hundreds of years of really interesting history.
Yeah, definitely. So the Great Law of Peace that's the governing structure.
Yeah, it's like the Constitution, if you like, and that was laid down. The basic founding narrative is that these guys were in conflict for centuries, and the reason it's called the Great Law of Peace was that it was a coming together of historic enemies, and providing a way for people who really disagreed on a lot of things to have a common governance and a way of resolving disputes and a way of living together. And so it basically there's essentially formed a series of councils, and there's a whole list of things that they do. And there's a women's council, there's councils of men and councils of women, and they have different areas in which they govern. And this a striking thing for the Europeans of the time was that you didn't have you could be a chief and you could be deposed. You didn't sort of get rid of your chief, and
Yeah.
chief's son wouldn't necessarily take over. It was the antithesis of the monarchy, and things had to be done by consensus. In other words, the chief was a relatively weak chief executive in our terms, and had to get the consent of the governed to do anything. And he didn't have the sort of formal authority that the king had. So it was, even though it wasn't a democratic system in the sense of voting and all of the stuff that we have, it was one that there was much more public participation and much more need for public consent. And Europeans of the 16th and 17th and 18th century thought this was completely fascinating, and a lot of them, especially the aristocrats, thought it was terrible.
Yeah, because they were trying to hold on to their own power.
Right. And so there's these, and I should say also that the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, had to their sort of north and west a group of people, the Huron or Wendat, who were their sort of traditional enemies, like France and England or something like that at the time, and but who had a somewhat similar form of government. And so when the Europeans encountered this sort of rich world in which there were confederations and alliances and hereditary things, European politics, except that the states involved, if you like, were completely different than European states. They weren't idiots. They thought this was really interesting, and what this told them about human nature and about how people should govern themselves.
It's interesting. So, and I may not pronounce this correctly, but Diganawanda?
There's a bunch of different, there's like a bunch of different ways that people pronounce it. Diganawanda is the way how I do, but anyway, this is the maybe a way to do it is, this is the guy whose name has come to us in sort of bastardized form as Hiawatha.
Okay. That's a lot different than the English spelling.
Yeah. So
who was that?
Okay. So he was the leading figure in the story. He was he was the guy who put together the and there's different versions of the story about how this was. So he was a charismatic figure with supernatural powers, who brought it all together, who is the main figure in the story of how the Great Law of Peace was constructed. And so he might be, this is I'm not sure that the Haudenosaunee themselves would be crazy about this, but he might be called the Thomas Jefferson of the Haudenosaunee. He was, and in the same way that if you go down to Washington and look at the statues of Jefferson, and he's this sort of exalted figure.
Yeah.
He's got the same kind of resonance for that. And essentially, there's multiple different versions of the story, but what he did was was to say, enough. We're killing each other. We've got to do something better.
Right. And so essentially what was ushered in was like what you were saying, not necessarily a direct democracy or democracy per se, but representative in a sense that there was both, in the U.S. terms, almost like the state system kind of correlated to the tribes, and then the federal government was this overarching confederacy that, while each tribe was individually unique, they all fed into, a general form of government.
Yes. And this, sort of, overall similarity, sort of like similarity looking at it from like the 30,000 foot level, led to a controversy that began, I think, really in the 1980s and continued on for a number of decades, in which some historians argued that the colonists, the English colonists, experience with the Haudenosaunee, who were major figures. I mean, they were the biggest and most important native nation that the people in New England had to contend with. That their experience with this led to the formation of the U.S. government in a strikingly similar way. And then other historians say this is all wet and this is ridiculous and so forth. And it's led to quite a bitter argument that to some extent still continues today. And in some places, especially New York, I believe this is the case. School kids are required to be taught about the connection between the Haudenosaunee and and particularly the Articles of Confederation, which was the predecessor to the actual U.S. Constitution.
That's interesting. I didn't know that they were taught that.
Yeah, I believe it was at one point it was required, and I think it still is. Shoot, I should have looked this up before I came to talk to you. Anyway, just homework for your listeners.
Yeah.
But the point is,
we'll see who fact checks it.
Yeah. The point is that there was this big big argument, and people have very different opinions. For what it's worth, I'll give you mine, which is that the influence was less a matter of direct copying than the presence of an example of people who were free. And one of the things that you find out from people talking to the Europeans talking to the Haudenosaunee is that they regarded the Europeans as slaves in a certain way. They had to do what the king said. Right. They didn't have a choice in the matter, and they couldn't. If the king was a jerk, they couldn't dump the king. And the Haudenosaunee thought this was like absurd and ridiculous. And the other thing that they were appalled by was that there's a real tradition of reciprocity. If you're a member of the Haudenosaunee, Confederation, and bad luck happens to you and your crops die or something like that, the society as a whole is obligated to try to take care of you. There's a real part of mutual aid, and that's part of the mutual consent. We all consent to be governed together with the implicit thing that the governance will then take care of us, if something happens, and watch out for our interests. And so this is not the case, and so there's various records of Native people going to England or France or what have you, and seeing the beggars on the street and being appalled and thinking that there must be something wrong with this government that they would allow this to happen. And there would be these big rich people and there would be these poor people, and this seemed to them totally screwed up.
Inhumane, really.
Yeah, inhumane. And kind of hard to argue with them, actually.
It is. Yeah, it's kind of something that we, accept in even modern society. I live in Chicago, and, there's plenty of people who are homeless living in the streets, and you see pretty frequently. And
so this was just like something is really weird is going on, that that you have this government that is clearly failing, because look at the presence of all these poor people, and nobody can get rid of it. You see this again and again, and this was for Europeans at the time who believed, essentially that there's the king and he was sort of supernaturally, given, he was, given by God this position, and then as a sort of representative of the whole thing, and then there's this class of people who are the aristocrats, and they're literally a different sort of people, and there's this kind of chain for Europeans, this idea that we're all in it together and that we're all fundamentally similar, and all have in this pact of mutual aid, was really shocking to encounter.
So I know that we had touched on the fact that the Iroquois Confederacy absolutely still around today, and still predominantly, some would argue, the longest standing representative governance in the world. In 1491,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of when they first, or just general First Nations people, have contact with the Europeans. How did that arrival of the Europeans on the North American uh, continent impact the local populations at that time?
Well, in a whole bunch of ways. In the same way you can think of that if Martians landed, there would be multiple, effects.
Be a lot of problems.
And yeah, it would be quite a shock. And that's, how different the Europeans were. They looked different, they acted different, they spoke differently. So one of the things that the two societies had really different kinds of technology,
Mm-hmm.
and each of them, benefited from the others. There's all these records of Haudenosaunee people looking at European shoes, for example, and thinking like, what the hell is wrong with them? They have these clunky things, instead of these super sophisticated, comfortable, and warm moccasins. They have these, horrible things that don't fit very well. European boats, like these small boats like coracles, and when you have these amazingly flexible canoes, and all this sort of stuff. So that, on the other hand, the Europeans had iron pots, knives, and the iron pots are really great, not because they cook better than the ceramic and clay pots that they had, but because they were much less breakable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you broke the pot, you had to then go and make a new one, which is a giant pain and took time and so forth. You had an iron pot, it was just so much easier. And the same thing was true for knives. They had obsidian stone knives, which are incredibly sharp, but they're brittle, and the edges broke. And those steel knives, iron and steel knives are more durable. So these were like things that people wanted, and there was a rich in exchange with that. And so there's European goods came in and changed people's lives in a day-to-day way. In the same, and also for the colonists, the native goods came in, and they started growing corn, for example, and so that lots of Europeans would come here and think those native that the English colonists had gone weird, dressing like the natives and eating their food and so forth. So that was like on one level, material culture that made it different. They had really, really different conceptions of what owning land meant. They both thought about owning land, but they thought about it differently. In that you were a Haudenosaunee person, you had your cornfield, but it was also part of this collective endeavor. So
you could feed other people.
You could feed other people. It was part. It was yours, but you were also implicitly understood to be contributing to the whole. And there wasn't really markets in the same way that there in these basic staples. If people needed it, it was put in a collective thing, and they got it. Although there was plenty of trade, it wasn't quite the same kind of thing. And they also didn't have fences. So your land didn't have fences around it. And this is for two reasons. Part of it is you might have your cornfield, but then you also had your berry patches. You had your you had the woods where you foraged and so forth. And so there's a whole blend and mix of different environments. Europeans, of course, thought this is my land, and I put a little square
the plot system.
I grow my wheat in here, and then I have another little square, and I put my cows here. It was all, from their point of view, the Haudenosaunee system was all like this weird jumble, and they didn't really own the land. Like there might be a patch of cornfield here, and then berries here, and then these things where they mixed crops here. It was hard for them to understand that the land was really being used. And so they would let their animals run wild, and part of the reason that the Haudenosaunee liked not having fences is that that the cornfield was bait for deer, right? The deer would come in and you'd have breakfast. So it was the lack of fences was a feature, not a bug. And but for Europeans, it meant it was really hard to understand what the heck was going on. And there's a tremendous amount of collision due to this. And these Europeans believed that because it wasn't ordered in the way that they understood, it therefore was unoccupied and therefore okay to grab.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine the conflicts over this. And then the final thing that I would mention, and I'm sorry for such a long-winded answer, but
No, totally okay.
To this is that European diseases came over here, and particularly in the 1600s, and by a quirk of history that we can talk about if you want to, there are very few contagious, lethal diseases in the Americas, before Europeans arrived. So there's none of these names that we're familiar with, smallpox, measles, mumps, diphtheria, influenza, plague, cholera, all those awful names that we know of just didn't exist here. And so Europeans came here, they followed in their train, and the probably the worst was smallpox. And in the 1630s, it swept into the Haudenosaunee, and then happened repeatedly thereafter. And it was as if all the suffering and death that these diseases had caused in Europe and Asia and Africa over millennia was compressed into a few decades, and so the results were devastating. One of the things that happened is just a large fraction of the Haudenosaunee died, and in this awful collapse, and it made it difficult for them to defend themselves, but also neither Europeans nor the Haudenosaunee had our modern understanding of disease. I mean, now we know that smallpox is caused by a virus, right? It's variola major is the name, and we know that it's not a supernatural force. It's this little sort of thing that goes in the air on droplets of your breath, and then you inhale it, and so forth. None of that was understood by either part. And in addition, the Haudenosaunee, like all the other Native peoples in the Americas, had no experience of contagious disease, so they didn't. The Europeans had all these institutions, quarantine, and you put these people away, and you separate. You did this and all these different ways of treating it. And for it was like this, it was like an H bomb went off and just wiped out, half of the Haudenosaunee at a stroke. And it was an awful thing. And it also, both of them understood disease as a manifestation of, supernatural. They thought it was like, and the Europeans thought, oh, good, God has brought these diseases to clear them away, which is horrible. But in a weird way, many of the Native people kind of thought the same thing. We must have done something wrong, and it was so there was a devastating spiritual part of this too, and it's a real tribute to human resilience that they got through it and are still surviving to be a thorn in the side of the U.S. to this day, a thorn in the side of New York and Ontario and Quebec and U.S. and Canadian governments.
Yeah, it's we talk about the community components of society and just how important the community and the collectivization is. If the answer of solving or mitigating some of the effects of these diseases, quarantine and isolation, as we've kind of learned in this whole COVID or post-COVID era, that would have just that wouldn't have gone very well.
Sure. I mean, because what you did is, your natural human sympathy, if you don't know this, is when somebody's sick, you go to them and you comfort them, and you pay
you help them out.
You help them out. And the terrible thing is that with something smallpox, that means that everybody gets it, the whole village gets it, people freak out totally rationally, and they what do some of them do? They flee to the next village to try to get away from it. And what do? They bring it with them. And so things get spread. And these were, densely populated clusters of villages. They were in constant communication. And so they were sort of, it sounds weird to put it this way, but like ideally suited to be hit by smallpox.
Right. One thing that I wish was better articulated is the passage of time and the significance of like how long things actually occur. And your book, 1491, kind of made that a little bit more clear to me. It's much more apparent when you read things to understand that like the time period in between when Columbus landed in North America and when colonization from the Europeans started was 100 years. And 100 years in context today is, we're talking about pre-World War II. All of
Right.
modern history that has occurred you can condense that modern history in that 100-year period post World War II. And so so there's about 100 years in between when the Europeans find North America, the diseases are kind of manifesting themselves around. And
so what happens, you can think of it this way. Columbus lands, that's 1492, as everybody knows. The first Spanish attempt, the first attempt by Europeans, the Spaniards, to make any kind of settlement on, in what we now think of as the United States, was 1526.
Okay.
Way south, just north of Florida, and it fails. There's a bunch of efforts to, plot little colonies on there, and they all fail until Jamestown, which is in the 1607 or 1608, 1609, that almost fails. 80% of the people die. It barely. It's that's not the kind of success you want, right? And then so all these efforts fail, and the reason is that Native people really aren't interested in having Europeans come and stay there.
Mm-hmm.
Happy to have them trade for a while, but then they would like them to go, and they drive them away, or if they fail to take the hint, they kill them.
Right.
What happens in about 1618 is that disease comes. We don't really know what it is, and wipes out a huge portion of coastal New England. And then 2 years later, comes the Mayflower, and the Pilgrims, and they actually are camping out on native villages that have been abandoned due to disease. And
right.
So, absent these diseases, you basically, in my view, don't have any of the sort of contemporary, the sort of American history that we know. The first, I believe, 50 or so European towns, British towns, and Dutch in New England were established on the sites of villages that had been emptied by disease. And this makes sense.
On the ruins, yeah.
On the ruins, so to speak. And this makes sense. They've cut down, they already have the cornfields there. They've cut down the trees. It's pretty easy to just move into this place that's already been prepared for you. And it's obviously a good place to live because people live there. So that, allows, the Massachusetts and Connecticut and the southern part of Maine to be taken over. And then in the 1630s comes this next epidemic that pushes out as far as New York. Mm-hmm. And that again opens up space. And I hope your listeners can hear me, making air quotes.
The air quotations.
Opens up space. I mean, because obviously, if you were a farmer and you were sick and you couldn't farm the land, you would not regard that land as being open, so that other people could come in and take it over.
Say, it's like I just can't get to it right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but that was a distinction that was lost on my ancestors. My ancestors are part of this group of people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in that group of people, so the period of colonization in that northeastern area, it spans roughly another 150 years.
Something like that. Yeah.
And so we go from that initial population, just call it like 100. And by the time that, we start talking about forming a different country, you're talking more so 2.5 million. So right. a lot of immigration, a lot of you know,
High birth rate.
yeah, high birth rates, just the population booming. Uh, to talk more about the motivations of those individuals at that time, it seems to be that generally the goal of people who are moving to the New World, or what they thought to be the New World, is they were looking for religious freedom, political liberty, economic opportunities. Do you think that they had found those things when they came
So,
over, or do you agree with that as their primary motivators?
so I'm going to pair. I know a guy named Bob Anderson,
Okay.
who is he's a genealogist, and he's the head of what they call the Great Migration Project, which is by the New England, let's see if I got this right, Historical and Genealogical Society, which is based in Boston. It's kind of an amazing organization.
Okay.
And this is an attempt to get as much biographical data as possible on every person who came to New England between the Mayflower and 1641, when there was a break in this because there was political crisis in England. They killed the king, and it all led to Cromwell. And so for a few decades there, hardly anybody came. So there was this time between roughly 1621 and 1641 when it's a distinct group of people, and those were the people who first created European style New England.
Okay.
And so Bob says, from everything he can tell, the overwhelming majority of people who came during that Great Migration came for religious freedom. And that meant the freedom to practice their religion. Now,
Mm-hmm.
notably, that did not always mean the freedom for other people to practice other religions. But those very definitely, some people believed in that. And they were persecuted in England, and driven to the Netherlands, which they didn't like because the Netherlands was religiously pluralistic, and so they came to establish utopia for their point of view. We call them the Puritans. They regarded that as an insult, and they called themselves various names like Pilgrims and Separatists and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. That's what we're talking about. The people with the pointy hats in our imagination. And so religious freedom was really important, and together with it, the idea that they could get land, that land was really short in England,
Right.
and so that you could get good land and you could establish this perfect state. And Governor Bradford, William Bradford, the first governor of Plymouth Colony, which is the first colony, he talks about all this in this actually quite a good book. It's one of the called Of Plymouth Plantation, which if you're a history buff, you should very definitely read. It's very readable, and how this was his goal. And then as time went on, it became more and more, from his point of view, soiled as just this, land grab and about grubby commerce, and people started caring less about being religious and becoming more like, Americans.
More individualistic.
Yeah, more individualistic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, so the intermingling of the cultures, as in this period where, while disease has certainly had its impact, the prevalence of the native cultures is still much more profound than it, from size perspective, than it is in modern day. Um, so they kind of more or less living side by side at this point.
Mm-hmm.
In one of your writings, you kind of mentioned this concept of like voting with your feet, which I found really interesting. Do you want to elaborate what voting with your feet kind of meant for these early colonists?
So I should say that what we're talking about here is actually, within a certain part of, American history research, controversial.
Okay.
And I am telling you, what I think, but there are certainly plenty of people who would say that Charles Mann guy is all wet. So, so take this. So these cultures live side by side. And there's a basic idea in much of sort of American historiography, if you know what I mean, is that they actually were completely separate. and had little impact on each other. And to me, this makes no sense at all. And I think it is also contradicted by the evidence. It makes no sense at all in the sense that, any place you go now, where there are different ethnic groups in the United States, you see cross fertilization. You can go to Queens and all these Asian neighborhoods, and what are they listening to? They're listening to hip hop, right?
Right.
And what are the hip hop guys eating? They're eating Chinese food, right? And watching martial art movies. And so, look at the Wu-Tang Clan, right? So you see, people do pick up stuff. And so to the idea that they're sort of separate in this way seems odd to me, just to begin with as a starting point. And there's also, I believe, historical testimony that they, while still believing themselves to be English people, were really not interested in being subordinate to the king and having this sort of social classes in the invaded, and that they noticed that was the way that Native people in the Americas were. They were a model of a different way to be, and plus there was all this exchange of goods. They weren't, if you're wearing Native style shoes, Native style pants, eating Native food, those people aren't as weird to you as they might be to somebody in England. And so there's cultural mixing. And also, now to get to your question finally, is and so there's a certain amount of crossing back and forth. And, one of my, I come from the Bellinghams, and one of the groups of, distantly related to one of the groups of people on the Mayflower, who was, and one of their first acts with their kid was to run away and go and live with the Indians because it was much more fun and much better fed. And so you had lots and lots of people doing this. And in addition, also in conflicts, Native people, grabbing, attacking some family that had encroached on their land, killing the dad and getting the mom and the kids and bringing them. And what was noted was that there's a striking number of those Europeans who did not want to go back after they had been adopted. And the other way around, because they also, would, during these conflicts, would capture Native people. Those Native people never wanted to stay with the Europeans. It's probably a little exaggerated. Very rarely wanted to stay. And people like, Benjamin Franklin noticed that the traffic was basically one way. The attraction was basically one way. And right. And so, I think this is entirely rational. And at one point I asked a bunch of historians, if you were living in the 17th century and you had a choice of being, living in, among the Pilgrims or among the Haudenosaunee, what would you choose? And they sort of hated that question because that's, judging the past by the, the standards of the present and all that kind of thing. But my journalist license to ask them the kind of uncomfortable question. And and I think I did it with 7 in a row, and all 7 of them said they would rather have lived with the Haudenosaunee.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, the food was better, and more of it, and you didn't have really crazy people in charge. It was sort of who would, Haudenosaunee, you could not be put in stocks for not going to church on Sunday, sort of thing. You're right.
Yeah, it was just kind of like they were seeking out more. So you say they were seeking out the religious freedom, and they kind of almost stumbled into just freedom.
Freedom. Yeah, freedom.
Like, it's not just like I can go and not have to worship the in the same way that the Anglicans want. I can go and I can live life entirely,
right?
Irrespective of these laws.
I don't have to worship anybody at all, and also I can live in a community where I can have much more say about what goes on. If a Haudenosaunee leader thought that it was really time to do a raid on some enemy, the leader just couldn't order you guys, troops, fall in line and do this.
Right.
The leaders had to.
We're invading France.
We're invading France. You have nothing to say about it. Leaders had to convince people that this was worth doing. And you had the option of saying, no, this is stupid. I don't want to do this. I don't want to risk my life for such a pointless purpose. So one of the things that you got from this was that Haudenosaunee leaders tended to be people who were, you know, excellent orators, who were very, very, very well spoken, and
Hmm.
because you had to be to convince people to risk their lives for you. And it also meant that, you know, that people didn't go, that it was much closer. You couldn't proceed without the consent of the people that you were leading. And I think this is pretty intoxicating.
Yeah. And the interesting, numerical values of consent versus majority is that it's like everyone had to agree.
Yeah,
It had to
everyone.
be, yeah, it wasn't
That
like a
means
controversial, like, oh, I got 51% or,
right. Brexit would not have,
2/3.
or this, yeah, majority rule. So, I saw this in a very small way. Personally, the I have a sideline where I work with a museum and exhibit designer who's a close friend. And my joking description of what I do is I provide the little black marks under the pictures.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. And one of the things that he has done is worked with a bunch of Native groups and done Native American cultural centers.
Okay.
And we did one for the Choctaw in Oklahoma. Wonderful bunch of people. Wonderful, in my opinion, wonderful project. And it's a large project. And at a certain point, the chief realized that not everybody was on board.
Mm.
And he stopped the project. We didn't do anything for a year while he got consensus and got everybody on board. And then it just moved through like lightning. So it's a very different kind of procedure, and it's slower in some ways and faster in some ways and more inefficient in some. It's just a very different
Yeah,
way of doing things.
definitely pros and cons to it.
Yeah.
Um, with a simple majority, you can kind of get things done faster, but
Right.
you have
Powerful when
and
everybody is, on board.
right. You don't have 49% dragging and kicking their feet along the way as you're
Yeah.
trying to go some direction. So, okay, cool. So as these cultures are intermingling in this period, we also, and I think this is also controversial in the historical world, but we have at the same time the Enlightenment movement
Mm-hmm.
in Europe,
Yeah.
and so we have individuals like John Locke or Kant who are kind of coming up with more or less like a European version of what is liberty, what is self-interest, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, and I know that many historians are conflicted on whether or not the experiences that the colonists in North America are having are influencing this tides of enlightenment. What are
Yes.
what are your thoughts on that?
So, so this all was brought up quite recently. You may have heard that there's a book that came out a year ago, maybe a little bit more, called "The Dawn of Everything,"
Mm.
by David Graeber and David Wingrove. Really interesting book. I would urge you to read it. Not a short
Okay.
book, really interesting. And one of their big arguments is that they take a kind of maximalist position that the European Enlightenment, this thing that you're talking about, sprang directly from encounters with indigenous people in the Northeast of North America, and this caused a big ruckus. And you can find lots of people saying they don't know what they're talking about, and other people saying, "Yeah, finally somebody's saying it." In this kind. um, so so I should say I'll tell you what I think, but you should
Yeah.
know that there's clearly some of you people would be experts in this would think that this man guy has no idea what he's talking about. So I mean it's that kind of thing. So there is very clearly European intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
Voltaire and Rousseau, and and all these people that you were mentioning, Locke and so forth, were fascinated by the discovery of these people, who are totally different from themselves, and had ideas totally different from themselves. And so you find things like Rousseau's first writings are these plays in which he's imagining encounters with native people. There's
Okay.
lots and lots of, the idea of a state of nature, which is a very important thing that, what is natural man? What is, what would people in this sort of unconstrained by history, what would they do and what would they be like? And so forth, all comes, in part from this encounter with people who are so different from themselves, who makes you realize that that we didn't have to be like we are.
Right.
And so I think that the influence is pretty strong. Now, there's a big caveat there, which is, when I go to Japan and I'm struck by all the things that I see, of course, I'm not understanding it very well. I have, this haze of misconception. I have my own ideas. I sometimes, see something in Japan that exemplifies what I think anyway, and I say, see, the Japanese are doing this, and so forth. And so some of that is also going on, that these people who are interested in these ideas are seizing upon things that they think are going on in this. And
confirmation bias almost.
Yeah, confirmation bias. So it's a real tangle of the influence coming in this way, and also people seizing on this to explain the things that they did anyway. And it's very hard to distinguish the two. And I think a lot of the argument is in a sense comes down to the silly insistence that only one of these two things is happening, when I think both of them are likely to happen. So Martin, the French essayist and philosopher, in his essays writes about, in his case, encountering people from Brazil and what they think and so forth. This clearly has a big impact on him because he writes about it so much, and he writes about it in a way that makes it clear that he has a big impact. But it's also, he's seeing it through his own web, his own lenses, if you like, and seizing upon the parts that he thinks he understands for his ideas. So both of these things are going on, and it's
right.
Cross-fertilization of cultures is really important.
Yeah, because it's not like someone you go in and it's like a teacher and student kind of mentality. It's two grown adults coming together, and particularly in that day and age, you didn't have translator apps and things. So,
so there was a kind of a renegade French nobleman named Lahontan, Lahontan, and he was a baron, which I think is kind of I always get confused about this, but I think is a kind of a low. But anyway,
yeah.
There, and he meets the Wendat, who are the Huron, that's in the French part, and he sees a guy named Kandirank. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And maybe I mentioned earlier that Native leaders tended to have to be really eloquent because they rule by persuasion rather than power, than sort of the power of the state. And so he runs into this guy, and he's blown away by his arguments about why the Europeans suck, and the European political system is awful, and the religion is dumb, and so forth, and why the Wendat are just have it so much better. And he writes these immensely popular books where he has these arguments, and they are the equivalent of these monster bestsellers in the France of the time. So there you can have, then of course there's this big argument, he didn't really meet anybody, he made it all up, and this is what he wanted to say, and all this sort of stuff. It seems pretty likely that he didn't make it all up. Of course he did, I'm sure, misinterpret parts of it and was what he wanted to say, because both of these things are going on. So you have multiple cases of things like this going on, which is I think is really fascinating, and sort of shows how it is true that the Enlightenment was entire, in these ideas we have of liberty and so forth that come from it, are all entangled with the discovery of these new people in the Americas in multiple ways.
Right. And so that kind of reaches a culmination with the Boston Tea Party.
Right.
Or one where,
of yeah, right. Exactly. I mentioned this in the book. They're giving their nose thumbing to British authority, right?
Right.
And what do they do? They dress up as Indians, right?
Yeah. They're
Right?
not dressed like John Locke or
No, no.
Immanuel Kant or
Yeah, because we are wild people. We are free people. We are outside the state, and we don't want to have anything to do with you.
yeah.
And so they're symbols of liberty. And
And that's
it's
not the only time in
cultural
which that
appropriation.
happens, right?
No, it happens all the time. I mean, and you see these things like where people are resisting the state, and there's always some clown who's dressed up like a Native American, and so
Yeah.
they become often against their will these sort of international symbols of freedom from oppression,
Right.
and it's sort of ridiculous, but it's also sort of true.
Right. No, I think it's really cool. That whole component of liberty and of the creation of what is, the modern democratic
Right.
movement. It does start with the founding of the U.S. From most modern perspectives, and so at this very strong moment, it's kind of leading in to say that this origin of liberty, this origin is from what we've encountered here, not necessarily what the ideology is manifesting and being sent back from England and France. So
yeah, well, those ideologies, they come from somewhere, and it's not the ideas that people have. Any ideas are not just sort of like these platonic things you're grabbing from the clouds. They're based on your own experience, what you've seen, and what you've read, and in that time, the from the European point of view, the discovery, the encounter with these very different people with very different ideas was, for obvious reasons, a really important and interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And so after this event occurs, and we sort of kick off the Revolutionary War and the foundation of what becomes the United States, I think that based off of my research, the founding father who seemed to have the most interest in the Iroquois and Native ways seems to be Ben Franklin.
And he's a complicated case because he both is interested in them. Well, Thomas Jefferson is also very, very interested, and they're both interested in them and opposed to them. And Jefferson was particularly like this. Franklin was a very complicated case, and he was sort of such a complicated guy that almost anything you say about him is true, as is the opposite. But Jefferson and those guys were very preoccupied by the fact that these initially 13 colonies were very different from each other. And they had been conceived as being independent from each other, and in fact their inability to collaborate and get along had actually doomed the Articles of Confederation, which is the first attempt to bring them. They had to have in their view, a stronger federal government, because otherwise they would just fly apart. And they were very concerned that the new country not fly apart into 13 pieces, both because they had fought to create this new country, and because they believed that only by sticking together would they possibly be strong enough to fight against Britain or France or any of the colonial powers that would just snap them up otherwise.
Right.
And so Jefferson and Washington conceived that the carving a country out of native lands would be the joint project. And so the native people, Indians, were like what we would all be unified against,
interesting.
So that
they couldn't be like, oh, because this is our common enemy, I can't necessarily say that I'm influenced by them.
Yeah, but of course you are. It's a very contradictory kind of relationship in which part of the reasons that the colonists were mad at the Brits was that the Brits had allied with the Haudenosaunee against the French, and so had taken this big area, the Ohio and Pennsylvania and chunks of the whole swath there, and said that's going to be reserved for them. And so, in a certain way,
Which is a large plot of land.
large plot of land. It was unquestionably occupied by the Haudenosaunee,
Mm-hmm.
and and a lot of the colonists said, "No, we want that land." So that they were indeed, in a weird way, fighting the Brits so that they could screw over the Haudenosaunee.
Yeah. The British seem to have much more cordial relations with the native populations than what the colonists ended up having.
Yeah, because the Brits saw them as potential allies against the French, and the colonists had these fractious both trading and these kind of things where you're trading with people and also maybe attacking them and they're attacking you, and there's
Yeah.
really complex and fraught relationship. Whereas if you're in London, you can just say, "Oh, well, these are our allies; they get this land." And the colonists would say, wait a minute, one of them killed Uncle Fred, right?
Yeah, I've actually seen that land.
Yeah. I don't want this crappy land. So that there was anyway. Yes. So on the other hand, they're tremendously influenced by them, but they also wanted to drive them out.
So, are you familiar with the Albany Plan of Union?
Just saying though, but this should not be that strange to us, because only an idiot would say that U.S. culture, our culture, my culture, has not been influenced by African American culture, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Roll, right? Hip hop, all these things. You just go on and on and on, and the enormous influence that African Americans. Yet at the same time, mainstream U.S. culture has treated African Americans really badly for a really long time, and so you can be influenced by somebody and even have a love for them, even as you're planning to screw them over.
Yeah, that's such a profound thing to say. It is almost like we have a long-term history of like love hate and kind of taking the cultural identities while also not acknowledging it or not really putting it as part of an identity.
Yeah, there's this great cultural mixing that takes place, and is really a big part of the history of our country that exists simultaneously as we're trying to drive them away and pretend that they have nothing to do with us.
Yeah, that's good. So yeah, Ben Franklin and the Albany Plan of Union. Are you familiar with that meeting?
No, yeah, to tell the truth, I haven't looked at it recently. So it sounds like you have. So maybe you should
yeah,
the more
sure, I can jump into it
right away, and right. So that I don't get it because if I explain it now, I'll get it 80% right. And the problem is I won't know what the 20% is.
It's okay. So the Albany Plan of Union was a meeting in Albany, New York, which occurred in 1754. And that was a meeting between, I think it was 7 or 8 of the colonies, which, as you said, we're talking about 100 to 250 years of history that colonies effectively live separately. That's the extent of the United States today. And so these are cultures that have manifested for hundreds of years that are slightly, have created differences among themselves just through isolation.
Living.
Yeah, through living. And so we have this meeting in the Albany Plan of Union. This meeting is specifically between the colonists and the Iroquois.
Yeah.
The Iroquois Confederacy comes to this meeting, and at this exact same time, so they're talking, the primary goal of this meeting was mutual defense. So we're meeting with the Iroquois to try and establish some agreements with mutual defense. At the same time, Ben Franklin comes out with this Albany Plan of Union, which is where the flag with the snake with 8, different pieces comes from. Is basically, it would never be said that it was influenced by the fact that the Iroquois could be this confederacy of 5 different tribes, basically what he proposes as a form of government and a form of defense is we are all different colonies, but we can come together in this form of union. And he creates this, document, which eventually it's agreed upon at this meeting. But the colonists, they go back to their individual colonies, and they more or less just everyone declines it. This is kind of silly. But the framework in which that document is placed, there's a lot of similarities to the Articles of Confederation and later the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is, again, that historians would argue about is the degree of that influence. To some extent, a federation. There's a lot of examples of federation. So
Sure.
merely the fact that Spain as a government is a federation of Aragon and Navarre and Castile and these different regions. Just to take a single example, France is a little bit like that too, where Burgundy and so forth used to be separate countries, and we're federated. And this is also an attempt to cast something in ways that at least they hope that the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, would go along with. Because it's important to know the Haudenosaunee are this major military power, and by themselves, they're more military power than any single colony.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah. So tensions are, and at that time, tensions are ratcheting up with France. And you remember, France and England have been fighting forever, and eventually you get not long after that the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War, as it's called, which is this global conflict, which is kind of set off in North America and goes as far away as the Philippines and so forth. So you have to see this in this context of war clouds are they're
yeah,
are allied with the Huron or Wendat, and that makes them, even though there's fewer of them than makes them quite powerful. If the Brits, meaning the colonies, can ally with the Haudenosaunee, that's an effective counterforce. But to make that happen, they actually have to ally with them. And to do that, to ally with them, they would actually have to give in to Haudenosaunee demands. Different colonies have different views about doing that. And obviously, if you're in South Carolina, pretty far away from everything, you're not as interested in doing it as if you're in New York, where you're right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so it's I think for me, and again, this is one of those things that people argue about. I would say that from what I recall, the things that really struck me about this was the Haudenosaunee are clearly being treated with as equal partners, and whose ideas have to be taken into consideration. And that's just a sign of how people took them as serious people. And there's all kinds of trappings in the way that they met. And if you look at the descriptions of the ceremonies, is that there's a whole lot of effort to incorporate Haudenosaunee protocol into this. So the Haudenosaunee protocol is very much focused on getting consensus. And one of the ways that you do that is that everybody socializes and does these sort of trust building exercises together to a frame. It's not like you sit across from each other at the table and you wrangle. You have dinner together, you make speeches, you have dances together, and you create this atmosphere in which negotiations can continue. And it worked. The only problem was that the people who went to this negotiation didn't have the authority to make the agreement. So when to the people who had the authority to make the agreement in the different colonies, they hadn't gone to the trust building exercises, they hadn't had the dinners, they hadn't had the speeches, and they said, "What the hell? No."
Yeah, that's so interesting. So the U.S. Constitution, Articles of Confederacy, these documents, they eventually get created. What do you think are the main differences between the U.S. Constitution or the Articles of Confederacy and the Great Law of Peace?
Um, well, in a sense, the democratic spirit is the same. They're both answers to the question, attempted answers to the question, how can we make people feel, how can we govern themselves? They both, are in a sense representative. The
Mm-hmm.
the difference is really the we have all these formal institutions, votes every 4 years and so forth. The Haudenosaunee is much more, a much more fluid process about achieving consensus.
Okay.
Uh, and what you don't have formal elections. What happens is that somebody says, you know, I think Schmedlap is screwing up. I think Schmedlap should get out of this job, and everybody agrees, and Schmedlap's out of his job because he can't persuade anybody to do anything. And the other thing that there is that's really important is that there are sort of separate spheres for men and women have a big role in Haudenosaunee society, and of course in the Constitution, women, black people,
Yeah.
people who don't own property, lots of people can't vote, so they aren't really citizens. In the Haudenosaunee, anybody who's Haudenosaunee can participate. They participate in different ways if they're men and women, but they participate. Women, very, very crudely speaking, women are in charge of domestic policy, and men are in charge of foreign policy. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but and so that is completely absent from this sort of. So you have in the Constitution much more formal mechanism for registering your opinion. That's the vote, but a much smaller class of people are actually allowed to vote.
Mm-hmm. And that, definitely changes over time. It seems like maybe at that moment, we, at the founding of the U.S., we're kind of mixing between the ideas of freedom and the ideas of Europe, which was very monarchical and hierarchical. And
it makes sense,
almost,
right?
Yeah.
It's a mishmash.
We couldn't just jump into it, but the culture and what was the American, or what would become the American mindset, was one of freedom. And so eventually, we buck the tides, and the things that were wrong with those systems and those movements, we eventually put in efforts to correct them.
Right. Very, very slowly. And, you could say that, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, which women are allowed to vote, and then the Civil Rights Act, we're getting closer to the universal franchise that was taken from the beginning from the Haudenosaunee.
Yeah. We're kind of just continuing to grow closer to the source material.
Yeah, if you like. And that's, I think a good thing. And you see, that if you include different people, they have different ideas. And so you see that in the different ways men and women vote. And there was, it's interesting. At the same time, there's a difference. And so I'll give you an example. In one of the Native groups that I worked with, there was a meeting about bringing in an artist to material outside, and this artist had some really fancy modernistic ideas and did not know how to read the room. And for this group, as in a number of the Native groups, the men were like the front men, but the women were the ones who made the decisions.
The decisions, yeah.
They did not understand that the most important people, the artist people, did not understand that the most important people in the room were these elderly women sitting in the back row who looked like they weren't even saying anything. And they presented this thing, and one of the women leaned over and whispered a couple of words to one of the guys, and the young guy, and that guy then leaned over and whispered a couple of words to an older guy, and the older guy said, "This doesn't seem very much aligned with our tribe." And that was it. The meeting was over, and
That's crazy.
they had no idea it was clear to us, to me watching, that they had no idea who the powerful people in the room were,
Yeah.
how that system worked, and who was making the decisions.
Came with
And
their own preconceived notions.
yeah, right. That these guys were the important guys, and so they started arguing with the guys. And the fact is, these women over here, and so that's a huge difference, and it's something you see actually quite often in North American Native groups. That the women have a really powerful role in decision making, even if it isn't necessarily public oration.
Mhm.
You know, and that is a real difference from the Constitution.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, just wrapping up here, then, the U.S., from a global perspective, does eventually become this kind of representation of liberty for the next 200 years, and as the French Revolution and other
Mm-hmm.
people come to play, they kind of use the American Revolution as kind of that first starting ground. 200 some years later, what do you think, or how do we continue to grow and cultivate that essence of liberty?
That's a really that's a really good question. So I'm gonna throw this out because I hadn't thought about it, and with the caveat that maybe this may not make any sense. So I'm gonna
That's all right.
right. I mean, one of the striking things to me is that there were, among the Haudenosaunee and among the Wendat, for that matter, and lots of the other groups, Lakota and and so forth. You were really free. I mean, the leaders did not have the right to coerce something. At the same time, you had collective obligations to the community. So you did have obligations, and you would be, it's not like you'd be put in jail, but you'd be hard pressed to stay a member of the community if you did, which was to help out.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody broke their leg and couldn't, do the farming, you helped out. There's
Right.
a very strong sense of collective responsibility for each other's welfare. And that was thought, I think, that gave a kind of baseline security so that people could experiment and try things on their own. And that sort of the sort of responsibility to give people the opportunities so that they could freely experiment. It seems to me something that we could really work on.
Gotcha. Interesting. So you're saying that to cultivate and grow liberty, we mostly just need to be able to give people the space in which to, find that or express themselves.
So. Right.
Yeah.
And
it's cool.
And if you so that if you fail, the punishment isn't so drastic.
Yeah.
Right. And so, somebody can say, hey, I've got a new type of corn here. Let me try it out. Right. And
right.
Right. And if it doesn't grow very
well.
I
love that. I love that example.
Yeah. Yeah. That I mean, that's the kind of thing you experiment, or, hey, I'm going to try, breeding a bunch of horses. If it doesn't work out, I know that I'll be able to still feed my kids. Yeah. And so
if it does work out, then we all benefit.
Then we all benefit because I'll give away some of the horses.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So, okay, cool. Well, last question for you, since it is a podcast on U.S. presidents. What would you say is your favorite U.S. president and why?
I mean, I think I think I'm supposed to say Lincoln, and my God, the guy, he was amazing. He was truly amazing. I mean, I'm a writer, and so I mean that guy could really write. Wow, can that guy write? Um, that's and then his sort of cunning and really remarkable guy. But I think my two favorite presidents are have to do with my this is a question that obviously reflects your own personal preferences and things. And one of the things I'm been really struck by is looking around in the world how rarely it is that people who are revolutionary leaders or leaders in general step down.
Okay.
Look at Africa. Look at Africa. Look at all these kings who kept going on.
Yeah.
Obviously senile or incompetent or sick or what have you, or just people really want to hang on to power. And so for me, Washington stepping down when he could have been king, we just have we're so lucky that he did that.
And it would have been normal.
It would have been normal. It would have been by world standards. They do this. I mean, look at even in places like China where they have these informal rules of look at Xi right now. He's made himself, king for life there. It's a really common thing for powerful people to just hang on to it and try to do this. And Washington stepping down is amazing. It's very hard for me to come up with another example of that. What an amazing guy to do that. And then we have people like Martin Van Buren, who not only stepped down like he was supposed to, but then went and served in a more humble capacity as a member of the House of Representatives and did great things.
John Quincy Adams.
Yeah. Excuse me, it's John Quincy Adams. I said Martin Van Buren, I meant John Quincy Adams. Sorry. You're right. And sorry, wrong guy entirely. Thank you. Wow.
No worries.
What happens when you are just thinking out loud is that you say stupid things. Anyway, thank you. Exactly. So that is to me amazing. And when I think of Washington, that's what I'm just stunned. And I mean, he did lots of things, but that by world standards is incredible.
Definitely. Awesome answer. So cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Charles. I think this has been an awesome discussion. I think that the listeners really enjoy it. So thank you so much again. It's been awesome.
Great. Nice to meet you.
You as well. As we conclude today's journey through the origins of liberty with Charles C. Mann on American Memoirs, we're left with a profound appreciation for the intricate tapestry of the human history and the diverse influences that have shaped our understanding of liberty and governance. Our exploration with Charles C. Mann, from the governance of the Haudenosaunee to the foundational principles of the United States, underscores the complexity and interconnectedness of human societies. Charles's insights have illuminated the profound impact of pre-Columbian Americas on the European thought and the subsequent birth of the Enlightenment ideals. The stories of the Iroquois Confederacy, their democratic principles, and their influence on figures like Benjamin Franklin remind us of the power of diverse perspectives in shaping our world. The intermingling of cultures, the clash of civilizations, and the shared human quest for freedom and dignity have all played their part in the narrative of liberty. As we reflect on the lessons from today's episode, it becomes clear that the essence of liberty, so deeply cherished in American ideals, is not the product of a single culture or moment in time. It is a complex amalgam of ideas and struggles and aspirations that have crossed oceans and transcended cultures. The journey of liberty continues to evolve, and we learn from our past and from each other, striving to embody the principles of democracy, equality, and justice in our communities and institutions. Big thanks to Charles C. Mann for his invaluable contributions to our understanding of this journey and for joining us on American Memoirs. To our listeners, we hope today's episode inspires you to delve deeper into the stories that have shaped our world and to contribute to the ongoing dialogue about liberty, justice, and the common good. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, keep exploring the memoirs of America and the endless stories that define our pursuit of liberty.